John Miller had always been a quiet man. Living in the calm suburban streets of Oakwood, he kept to himself, never causing any trouble, never drawing attention. His house was modest but well kept, with a neatly mowed lawn, a small garden filled with roses and daisies, and a mailbox that was, until today, perfectly ordinary. John liked his routines. He enjoyed mornings with a cup of coffee on the porch, afternoons reading in his study, and evenings spent watching the sunset behind the trees lining the street. Life was simple, peaceful, and predictable. But that peace was about to be shattered. It started with a knock at the door. At first, John thought it might be one of his neighbors coming over to borrow sugar or to chat. But when he opened the door, he saw two uniformed police officers standing there. Their expressions were serious, professional. There was no warmth, no small talk, just the kind of official business that made anyone take notice. "Good morning, sir," one of them said politely but firmly. "We're here on behalf of the Homeowners Association. They've flagged a violation on your property. We need you to address it immediately." John raised an eyebrow, his mind already running through the possibilities. A violation? What could it be? He glanced at his mailbox, then back at the officers. I see," he said slowly. "What kind of violation are we talking about?" The taller officer stepped forward. "Your mailbox is slightly crooked, sir. The HOA requires it to be straight and aligned with the street. They've sent multiple notices, but no action has been taken. You need to fix it immediately or face penalties." John nodded, giving a calm, polite smile. "Of course," he said. "I'll take care of it." Inside, however, his mind was working at full speed. He wasn't just a quiet neighbor who enjoyed simple routines. John Miller was an FBI agent. His cover in Oakwood was supposed to be perfect, and it had been until now. A small violation like a crooked mailbox was nothing compared to the dangers he usually faced, but the unexpected arrival of the officers triggered his instincts. He noticed details immediately, the way the taller officer shifted his weight, the subtle tension in the other's jaw, the way their eyes scanned the yard as if they were expecting to find something more serious. John felt a small thrill. These men had no idea they were standing in front of someone trained to handle far more dangerous situations than crooked mailboxes. And yet, he knew he had to be careful. One wrong move could draw unnecessary attention. "Would you like me to straighten it now?" John asked, gesturing toward the mailbox. The officer nodded. "Yes, sir. That would be best. We don't want this to escalate." John stepped outside, feeling the warm morning sun on his face. He picked up the small wrench and screwdriver he kept in the garage for minor repairs. As he worked on the mailbox, he kept up a steady stream of casual conversation. "Beautiful day today, isn't it?" he said, trying to sound relaxed. "Yes, it is," the shorter officer replied. "Spring in Oakwood is always nice. Trees blooming, kids playing, it's a good neighborhood." John smiled. "I agree. I've lived here a few years now. It's peaceful, friendly. That's why I chose it." The taller officer watched him for a moment, then added, "You don't usually get visits like this, do you?" John chuckled softly. "Not really. I guess I've been lucky." As he tightened the last bolt on the mailbox, John's mind wandered briefly. He thought about the people he usually dealt with in his line of work: criminals, informants, and dangerous situations where mistakes could cost lives. Compared to that, dealing with the HOA and a crooked mailbox seemed almost comical. Yet, the tension he felt now was real. These officers represented authority in his world today, and he couldn't afford to show any weakness. "Looks good," he said finally, stepping back to admire his work. The mailbox now stood perfectly straight, aligned with the curb as the HOA required. The officers nodded. "Thank you, sir. That should resolve the issue," the taller one said, jotting something down on his notepad. "We appreciate your cooperation." John smiled politely again. "I'm happy to comply. I want to be a good neighbor." As the officers turned to leave, John closed the door and leaned against it for a moment, exhaling slowly. The immediate tension was gone, replaced by a familiar calm. He knew the HOA had no idea who they were dealing with. They saw him as a quiet, polite man who followed the rules. Little did they know, John Miller had spent years in the FBI, handling situations far more dangerous than a neighborhood dispute. Once the officers were gone, John moved to his study and sat down at his desk. He pulled open a drawer, revealing a stack of files, reports, and case notes. This was his real-life one that no one on the suburban street could ever imagine. He glanced at the mailbox again through the window, a small smirk forming on his lips. The victory wasn't just in fixing it, it was in knowing that he had handled the situation perfectly, without revealing a single clue about who he really was. For the rest of the morning, John went about his routine. He watered the garden, checked the mail, and even brewed another cup of coffee. Yet, a part of him remained alert. His instincts had been triggered, and he knew he couldn't afford to ignore them. He began thinking about potential threats, even small ones like an overzealous HOA could create complications if handled poorly. Around noon, he decided to take a walk through the neighborhood. He wanted to observe, to gather information about the people who oversaw the HOA and the officers who enforced their rules. As he walked, he greeted neighbors politely, some of whom stopped to chat. He learned about their families, their routines, and their small complaints about neighborhood issues. Every detail was noted, filed in his mind. Not because he planned anything malicious, but because observation and awareness were habits he couldn't shake. Later that afternoon, as he returned home, John noticed the HOA truck parked down the street. Two members were walking briskly toward a neighbor's house, clipboards in hand. He paused, pretending to check his phone, and observed. They were meticulous, focused on rules and regulations, unaware that they were part of a larger world filled with risks they could never comprehend. Back in his living room, John reflected on the morning's events. A crooked mailbox might seem trivial, but it was a reminder that appearances mattered in Oakwood. And appearances mattered in his line of work too, sometimes even more. People judged based on what they saw, and they rarely suspected the truth hidden beneath the surface. By evening, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. John sat on his porch, sipping tea and watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange. The tension of the morning had faded, replaced by a calm satisfaction. He had faced authority, handled it perfectly, and no one had any idea of the life he led behind the walls of this ordinary house. For John Miller, the day had been a small battle, a test of patience, composure, and subtle strategy. And he had passed it without a single misstep. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new encounters, and perhaps even more scrutiny from the HOA. But for now, he could enjoy the simple peace of his neighborhood, knowing that the most dangerous aspects of his life were safely hidden from view. As night fell over Oakwood, John finally allowed himself to relax completely. He turned on a small lamp, opened a book, and let the quiet sounds of the suburban street fill the room. The mailbox was straight, the officers were gone, and the neighborhood believed they knew John Miller. And that was exactly how he wanted it. The next morning, John Miller woke before sunrise, as he always did. The streets of Oakwood were still quiet, wrapped in a soft layer of mist, with dew glistening on the grass. He stood by the window, looking out at his perfectly straight mailbox, still smiling faintly at the memory of yesterday's visit. He made his coffee slowly, savoring the warmth and aroma, and let his mind wander. The HOA officers were gone, but the situation lingered in his thoughts. A crooked mailbox might seem trivial, yet it represented the small ways rules could intrude on personal life. John had handled it carefully, but he knew that sometimes, the smallest things could escalate if not managed properly. After finishing his coffee, he decided to take a short walk around the neighborhood. Walking through the familiar streets gave him a sense of calm and also served another purpose: observation. Every neighbor he passed was a piece of a puzzle, every routine a small clue to the dynamics of Oakwood. He greeted Mrs. Parker, an elderly woman watering her flower beds. "Good morning, Mrs. Parker," he said politely. "Good morning, John. Did you fix that mailbox already?" she asked with a cheerful smile. John chuckled lightly. "Yes, I did. HOA should be satisfied now." She nodded, frowning slightly. "They can be strict sometimes, but it's all for keeping the neighborhood nice, I suppose." John smiled, understanding her point but thinking differently. Rules were meant to be followed, yes, but sometimes people who enforced them didn't realize the hidden layers of life around them. He continued walking, watching neighbors tending to lawns, children riding bicycles, and joggers running along the street. Everything seemed normal, peaceful, but in John's mind, he was always alert, noticing small details others would never consider. Back at home, John returned to his study. The morning sunlight filtered through the blinds, falling on the desk stacked with files, notes, and a laptop. Though his outward appearance was that of an ordinary man, his mind was always running calculations, analyzing situations, planning next moves. The HOA officers and their routine checks were small matters compared to his work in the FBI, yet the discipline required was no different. Every interaction, every word spoken, could leave a subtle mark. He decided to prepare for the possibility of another visit. Though the mailbox was fixed, HOA representatives often returned unexpectedly. He reviewed the layout of his house, thinking of subtle ways to manage future encounters without raising suspicion. He reminded himself that patience and calm were his strongest tools. Authority might seem intimidating, but it could be managed with the right approach. Around noon, a faint knock echoed through the house. John's instincts immediately went on alert, but he relaxed when he saw it was only his neighbor, Daniel, a young father with a friendly smile. "Hey, John," Daniel said. "I saw the mailbox. Looks perfect now. HOA finally happy?" John laughed lightly. "Yes, they seem satisfied. It was a small task, but I handled it." Daniel nodded. "You know, I don't know how you manage to stay so calm with them around. I get nervous every time I get a letter from the HOA." John shrugged modestly. "I guess I just try to stay polite and follow the rules. Makes life easier." Daniel laughed. "If only I could be as patient as you. Sometimes I feel like they just look for reasons to cause trouble." John nodded thoughtfully. He understood Daniel's frustration. The HOA had a way of making small issues feel larger than they were. But he also understood another truth: authority often had blind spots, and patience could turn those blind spots into opportunities. After Daniel left, John spent the rest of the afternoon doing ordinary tasks, watering plants, reading the newspaper, and organizing his home. Yet, in the back of his mind, he stayed alert. Every detail, every sound, every passing car was noted mentally. Being an FBI agent had trained him to observe constantly, even in the calmest settings. Later in the afternoon, John decided to visit the small community park near his home. Children were playing on swings, their laughter filling the air, and neighbors strolled along the paths. He watched quietly, noting interactions and patterns. The HOA often organized events here, and he knew that their presence could mean further scrutiny. But he also recognized that these events could serve as opportunities. Being friendly, helpful, and compliant could strengthen his cover. He noticed two familiar faces, the HOA representatives who had visited his house. They were speaking with a group of neighbors, gesturing toward rules and regulations, and occasionally glancing in his direction. John's lips curved into a faint smile. They still did not recognize him for who he truly was. To them, he was simply a quiet, polite man who followed the rules. John walked closer, nodding politely as he passed. "Good afternoon," he said warmly. The taller HOA member nodded back. "Afternoon, John. Beautiful day, isn't it?" "Indeed it is," John replied, smiling. "The neighborhood is looking very nice this season." He continued walking, using the interaction to observe their behavior. They were confident in their authority, but subtle gestures and glances betrayed slight tension. John noted it carefully. Authority was often a show, and those who wielded it sometimes had hidden insecurities. Understanding that could be more valuable than mere compliance. Returning home, John prepared a light lunch and then settled into his favorite chair by the window. The afternoon sun bathed the room in a warm glow. As he sipped his tea, he reflected on the morning's events and the subtle interactions in the park. Life in Oakwood seemed peaceful to everyone else, but he knew that even the calmest places had layers of complexity. Every small detail mattered. By evening, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. John decided to take another walk, this time toward the far end of the neighborhood. The street was nearly empty, except for a few joggers and a dog walker. He paused for a moment, observing the houses and yards, noting which ones were carefully maintained and which showed signs of neglect. Patterns and habits, he reminded himself, could reveal more than rules ever could. As he returned home, John noticed the faint sound of a car approaching. He looked up and saw the HOA truck parked at the end of the street. Two representatives stepped out, clipboards in hand, moving toward a neighbor's house. John paused, pretending to check his phone, while he observed. They were meticulous, reviewing lawns, noticing small imperfections, and recording details. To them, this was ordinary work. To John, it was a lesson in authority and human behavior. Back inside, he made a mental note to remain courteous and composed during any future interactions. It was a simple strategy: always comply visibly, always maintain a friendly demeanor, and never reveal frustration. Those principles had served him well in dangerous situations, and they were equally effective in Oakwood. That night, John sat on his porch, watching the neighborhood slowly darken as streetlights flickered on. The world seemed calm and ordinary, yet he remained alert, listening for unusual sounds, watching for movement, and keeping his senses sharp. It was a habit ingrained deeply over years of FBI training. Peace, he knew, was not simply the absence of trouble, it was the ability to remain calm, composed, and aware in the face of it. As he went inside to prepare for bed, John reflected on the day. The HOA officers had not returned to his house, but their presence lingered in his mind. The crooked mailbox incident had been minor, yet it had reminded him of the subtleties of human behavior, the layers of authority, and the value of patience. He felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that he had handled everything perfectly, without revealing a single detail of his true identity. Finally, as he turned off the lights and settled under the covers, John allowed himself to relax completely. Tomorrow might bring new visits, new challenges, and even more scrutiny from the HOA. But for now, he could enjoy the calm of the night, knowing that the most dangerous parts of his life remained hidden, safely tucked away behind the walls of his quiet suburban home. And so, John Miller drifted into sleep, aware that peace was temporary, vigilance was eternal, and sometimes, strength was found not in confrontation, but in quiet observation and subtle strategy. The following morning, John Miller woke early as usual, the soft light of dawn filtering through his blinds. The streets of Oakwood were quiet, still shrouded in the gentle fog that lingered from the night before. He sipped his coffee slowly, savoring the warmth, and let his eyes wander over the familiar view outside the window. Everything seemed ordinary, calm, and peaceful. But John knew better. Even in a quiet neighborhood like this, there was always a layer of complexity beneath the surface. The visit from the HOA officers yesterday had left a mark, not a visible one, but a subtle tension that John could feel. The crooked mailbox had been a minor issue, easily resolved, yet it reminded him that even small rules could have significant consequences if mishandled. And more importantly, it reminded him that some people wielded authority without understanding the nuances of the lives they governed. He finished his coffee and stepped outside for a short walk. The morning air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of freshly cut grass. As he strolled down the street, he noticed his neighbors beginning their day. Mrs. Parker was tending her garden, while children rode their bikes and played on the sidewalk. Everything appeared normal, yet John's sharp eyes observed subtleties: the way people reacted to the presence of the HOA truck parked a few houses down, the slight hesitation of some neighbors as they glanced at the officers' clipboards, the whispered conversations about rules and penalties. John approached Mr. Lewis, a middle-aged man walking his dog. "Good morning, Mr. Lewis," John greeted warmly. "Morning, John," Mr. Lewis replied, a hint of concern in his voice. "I saw the HOA folks were at your house yesterday. Everything okay?" John smiled reassuringly. "Yes, it was a small matter. Fixed the mailbox, and that was that. No need to worry." Mr. Lewis nodded but didn't seem entirely convinced. "They can be persistent sometimes," he muttered, as though speaking more to himself than to John. John listened carefully, noting the subtle tension in the man's tone. He understood that people often let small frustrations linger in their minds, turning minor issues into larger concerns. That kind of knowledge could be useful, he thought, if handled correctly. Returning home, John decided to focus on preparation. He sat at his desk and opened a folder containing notes and personal reminders. Though the mailbox incident seemed resolved, he knew that HOA representatives were methodical. They could return unexpectedly, armed with lists, clipboards, and an unwavering commitment to enforce rules. John began thinking through potential scenarios: how to handle a visit gracefully, how to remain calm under scrutiny, and how to ensure his cover remained intact. He spent the morning reviewing neighborhood patterns. He noted which homes were well maintained, which yards had slight imperfections, and which neighbors were most involved in HOA activities. Everything was part of a mental map he was creating, a subtle understanding of Oakwood's social structure. In his line of work, observation was key, and even here, in this calm suburban setting, he applied the same principles. By late morning, he heard a faint knock at the door. John's instincts immediately went on alert, but he relaxed when he saw it was Daniel, the young neighbor with the friendly smile. "Hey, John," Daniel called, holding a small bag. "Thought I'd drop by with some cookies for the HOA meeting. Figured you might want one." John chuckled. "Thanks, Daniel. That's thoughtful of you." He invited him in, and they sat at the kitchen table. As Daniel spoke about his work and family, John listened carefully, asking casual questions and nodding at the right moments. But his mind remained alert, analyzing every detail. How long would the HOA meeting last? Who would attend? How strict would the representatives be this time? Even ordinary conversations held layers of information. After Daniel left, John returned to his study, reflecting on the neighborhood dynamics. He realized that the HOA, while seemingly rigid and bureaucratic, was not without weaknesses. They were predictable, and people around them reacted in ways that could be anticipated. Understanding human behavior, he reminded himself, was as valuable as knowing rules and regulations. Around midday, a sound outside drew his attention. The HOA truck had returned, this time moving slowly down the street. John watched quietly through the blinds. Two representatives were walking from house to house, clipboards in hand, speaking with neighbors about landscaping, fences, and small violations. Their presence was methodical, almost ritualistic. John noted their behavior carefully. They were confident in their authority, but there were subtle signs of insecurity, slight glances toward houses they had not yet inspected, small hesitations when approaching certain neighbors, and murmured conversations that indicated uncertainty. John smiled faintly. They had no idea that someone was observing them just as closely. In the afternoon, John decided to prepare for a potential direct visit. He cleaned the house meticulously, ensuring that everything appeared orderly. He arranged furniture to create a welcoming yet controlled environment, checked the alignment of picture frames, and even rehearsed polite responses to questions the HOA might ask. Every detail mattered. As the day progressed, John reflected on the balance between compliance and strategy. To the HOA, he appeared as a model resident, polite, cooperative, and law-abiding. But behind that facade was a trained agent, capable of handling far more complex situations. This duality was not arrogance, it was discipline, patience, and careful calculation. By evening, the sun cast long shadows across the neighborhood, and John decided to take another walk. The streets were quieter now, with children indoors and neighbors preparing dinner. He noticed the HOA representatives returning to their truck, completing their rounds. Their expressions were neutral, but John sensed subtle frustration. Some neighbors had minor issues, and not everyone responded as expected. He paused for a moment on the sidewalk, observing the interaction between the HOA officers and a neighbor who seemed particularly nervous. The neighbor's body language was tense, hands gripping a clipboard, eyes shifting rapidly. The HOA officers maintained authority, but John could see the cracks in their confidence. Returning home, he realized the significance of the morning and afternoon observations. Authority, he thought, often depended on perception. People respected or feared rules, but the enforcers themselves were human, subject to doubt, hesitation, and subtle influence. Understanding these nuances was key. Inside, John prepared a light dinner and reflected on the day. The mailbox incident had been resolved, but it had triggered a series of subtle events, observations, social interactions, and strategic calculations that shaped his understanding of Oakwood. Even in a peaceful neighborhood, he realized, one had to be attentive, patient, and thoughtful. After dinner, he returned to his study, reviewing notes and mentally mapping interactions. Each neighbor, each HOA officer, each minor incident became part of a larger picture. Patterns emerged, showing tendencies, habits, and subtle weaknesses. For John, this was more than observation, it was preparation, ensuring that future encounters could be handled with grace and precision. As night fell, John stepped onto the porch, gazing at the calm streets of Oakwood. The neighborhood appeared peaceful, almost idyllic, yet he remained alert. Quiet observation, he reminded himself, was the first step to managing any situation. Finally, he retired to bed, feeling a quiet satisfaction. He had navigated the day with skill and composure, maintaining his cover while observing the environment carefully. Tomorrow could bring new challenges, new visits from the HOA, and perhaps unexpected interactions with neighbors. But for now, John Miller allowed himself a moment of calm, confident that his patience, strategy, and awareness had once again preserved his quiet secret. And so, as the lights dimmed and the streets of Oakwood settled into the night, John drifted into sleep, aware that the world around him was layered with small rules, human behaviors, and subtle authority. Strength, he knew, often lay not in confrontation, but in understanding, patience, and quiet strategy. The morning sun broke through the trees, casting soft light across the streets of Oakwood. John Miller awoke earlier than usual, as he always did. The events of the past week had taught him that even in a calm neighborhood, vigilance was necessary. The HOA had grown more active after the crooked mailbox incident, and while John had handled it carefully, he knew that their next steps could be more persistent. He began the day with his usual routine, a cup of coffee on the porch, watching the world awaken. Children were leaving for school, neighbors were opening their garages, and the distant hum of morning traffic created a gentle rhythm. Everything appeared ordinary, yet John's trained eyes noticed the subtle changes: an HOA truck parked unusually close to a neighbor's house, a man with a clipboard glancing repeatedly at the street, and the slight tension in the expressions of familiar faces. John took a deep breath, appreciating the calm while mentally preparing for what might come. He decided to focus on small, strategic actions today, maintaining his cover while subtly influencing the neighborhood's perception of him. In his line of work, subtlety often had more power than confrontation. Around mid-morning, a knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. John's instincts immediately heightened, but he maintained a calm exterior. Opening the door, he found two HOA representatives standing there, clipboards in hand, faces serious but polite. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," said the taller one. "We are conducting follow-ups on neighborhood compliance. We noticed some minor discrepancies in your landscaping. We would like to review them with you." John smiled politely. "Of course. Please come in." He led them into his living room, offering coffee, a small gesture that projected calm and hospitality. As they accepted, John maintained a steady, relaxed demeanor, while mentally observing every detail, their posture, their expressions, and the slight hesitation in their movements. "You have maintained your yard very well," the shorter representative began. "But there are some areas where grass height and plant alignment could be improved according to HOA guidelines." John nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you for pointing that out. I take pride in keeping my home presentable. I'll make adjustments right away." As he spoke, he noticed the subtle reactions of the representatives. They were confident in their authority, but small signs of uncertainty flickered in their eyes. John recognized these micro-expressions immediately. Authority, he reminded himself, was often a show, and even those who wielded it had moments of doubt. After discussing the minor issues and offering assurances, the representatives left, satisfied with John's responses and his willingness to comply. Once the door closed behind them, John exhaled slowly. The encounter had been handled perfectly, yet it also reinforced the lesson he had learned over years of training. Composure and subtle strategy were invaluable tools. Deciding to turn the day into an opportunity, John focused on observation. He stepped outside to tidy the garden, making minor adjustments to the flower beds and mowing the lawn with precise care. Neighbors passing by waved, and John greeted each with a friendly smile. To them, he appeared as a model resident, polite, cooperative, and unassuming. Behind the calm exterior, however, he was continuously analyzing patterns, behaviors, and tendencies. By afternoon, John noticed an HOA event taking place at the community park. A group of residents had gathered, discussing landscaping plans, property guidelines, and neighborhood activities. The representatives from his house were present, walking among the crowd with clipboards and measuring tapes, checking yards and making notes. John walked casually toward the park, carrying a small bag of tools and supplies. His intention was simple: to maintain the appearance of helpfulness while observing, learning, and subtly influencing the situation. "John. Over here," called Mrs. Parker, waving him toward the gathering. He smiled warmly. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Parker." She beamed. "We're planning a small community garden project. We could use someone with your skills and attention to detail." John nodded. "I'd be happy to help." As he joined the group, he maintained a calm, polite demeanor, interacting with neighbors and contributing practical suggestions. He helped measure areas for planting, adjusted small sections of the garden layout, and offered advice on plant alignment. All the while, he observed the HOA representatives, noting their focus on rules, their slight impatience when things deviated from their expectations, and their subtle efforts to maintain authority. John recognized an important opportunity. By showing helpfulness and cooperation, he could build trust, reduce scrutiny, and reinforce his image as a compliant resident. This approach was subtle but effective, a strategy that allowed him to maintain control of the situation without confrontation. Later in the afternoon, John returned home, carrying a small notebook where he jotted observations. Every interaction, every minor rule enforcement, and every neighborhood pattern was recorded mentally and physically. The HOA had authority, but John's knowledge of human behavior, patience, and careful planning allowed him to navigate their oversight effectively. As the day wore on, a neighbor stopped by with a question about landscaping rules. John listened attentively, offering advice based on his observations and understanding of HOA guidelines. He remained patient, polite, and composed, reinforcing his reputation as a model resident while gathering additional insights into the neighborhood dynamics. By evening, John took a moment to reflect. The day had been productive, not only in maintaining his cover but also in understanding the nuances of Oakwood's social structure. Authority could be managed, he thought, when approached with calmness, subtle influence, and careful observation. He realized that even seemingly minor actions, adjusting a flower bed, offering help, or engaging neighbors, could have lasting effects on perception and control. As night fell, John walked to the porch, sipping a cup of tea and watching the quiet streets. The HOA representatives had left, and the neighborhood had returned to its usual calm. But John remained alert. He knew that authority figures, no matter how minor or formal, could return unexpectedly, and the key to maintaining his safety and secrecy was constant vigilance. He reviewed the day's interactions in his mind. Each smile, each nod, and each subtle gesture had reinforced his image as a compliant, helpful neighbor. Meanwhile, he had gathered valuable insights into the HOA's methods, weaknesses, and tendencies. Patience, observation, and subtle influence had turned a potentially stressful situation into an opportunity. Finally, John retired to his study, opening a small folder containing notes from the day. He reviewed his observations carefully, noting patterns in HOA behavior, neighborhood interactions, and human responses to authority. He also made plans for future engagements, considering ways to maintain his cover while subtly guiding the social dynamics of the community. By the time he went to bed, the streets of Oakwood were dark, quiet, and calm. Yet John's mind remained alert, reflecting on the subtle lessons of the day. Even in a seemingly peaceful neighborhood, authority, human behavior, and perception created a complex landscape. He understood that strength was not always shown through confrontation, but often through patience, subtle strategy, and quiet observation. As he drifted into sleep, John felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The HOA had visited, the neighborhood had interacted with him, and yet his secret remained intact. He had navigated the day with skill, composed behavior, and strategic subtlety. Tomorrow, he knew, would bring new challenges, but he was ready. Vigilance, patience, and careful planning had preserved both his cover and his calm in Oakwood. The next morning, John Miller woke with the same calm precision he had cultivated over the years. Oakwood streets were quiet and still, with soft sunlight spilling across the lawns. The previous week had been full of subtle tension, HOA inspections, and neighborhood interactions, but today John felt a quiet confidence. He knew that careful observation, patience, and strategic action had shifted the balance. After his morning coffee, he walked to the window and watched the neighborhood slowly come alive. Children rode their bikes, neighbors chatted briefly on the sidewalk, and the HOA truck sat idle a few blocks away, as if waiting for new tasks. John noted the subtle cues in the atmosphere: the slight relaxation of officers' posture, the neighbors' casual smiles, and the general sense of ease that had returned to Oakwood. He smiled to himself. The HOA had been persistent, but patience and subtle influence had turned their scrutiny into a routine interaction, no longer a source of tension. John knew that control often came not from confrontation, but from understanding, observation, and quiet strategy. Around mid-morning, there was a knock at the door. John's instincts went immediately on alert, but he maintained his calm exterior. Opening the door, he found the HOA representatives standing there once again. Their expressions were polite, almost neutral, but John sensed that their demeanor had shifted slightly. There was less authority in their posture, more openness to engagement. "Good morning, Mr. Miller," the taller representative said. "We're conducting a final review of neighborhood compliance. We'd like to discuss a few minor points with you." John smiled warmly. "Of course. Please come in." He led them into the living room, offering coffee and a comfortable place to sit. As they accepted, John kept a steady, polite tone, carefully balancing compliance with subtle reassurance. His goal was simple: demonstrate cooperation while reinforcing his image as a thoughtful, model neighbor. "Your yard is very well maintained," the shorter officer began. "But there are a few minor points we'd like to address regarding plant alignment and walkway edges. Nothing serious, but it's part of our compliance check." John nodded. "Thank you for letting me know. I'll take care of it immediately." As they spoke, John noticed small signs of fatigue in the representatives' expressions. Their focus was on maintaining authority, but subtle frustration and impatience were creeping in. John understood that even the most diligent enforcers could feel pressure when faced with someone patient, composed, and cooperative. Over the next hour, John walked the representatives through his yard and garden, explaining small adjustments he had made, detailing his approach to compliance, and answering questions with calm, measured responses. He allowed them to inspect the property thoroughly, maintaining transparency without revealing more than necessary. When the representatives finally stood to leave, the taller officer nodded appreciatively. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Miller. Everything appears satisfactory. We'll mark your property as fully compliant." John smiled politely. "I appreciate your guidance. I hope the neighborhood continues to thrive." After the door closed behind them, John exhaled deeply. The situation had reached a quiet resolution. The HOA had acknowledged his compliance, his reputation in the neighborhood had strengthened, and his secret remained intact. The seemingly small victory was meaningful. In Oakwood, perception mattered as much as rules, and John had navigated both perfectly. Deciding to take advantage of the calm, John stepped outside to work in his garden. He adjusted a few plants, straightened the edges of his walkway, and tended to the small community garden project he had been helping with over the past days. Neighbors passing by greeted him warmly, many commenting on the beauty and order of his yard. "Your garden looks amazing, John," Mrs. Parker said, smiling as she tended her own plants. "Thank you," John replied. "I enjoy keeping it neat. It's relaxing and satisfying." The small interactions reinforced his image as a diligent, kind, and cooperative neighbor. While outwardly ordinary, each gesture carried strategic value, strengthening trust, reducing scrutiny, and solidifying his quiet influence in the community. By late afternoon, John returned indoors to review notes and reflections from the past week. He had carefully observed every interaction, every visit from the HOA, and every subtle behavior in Oakwood. Patterns had emerged, habits, expectations, and tendencies that allowed him to anticipate future events and respond strategically. He realized that authority, whether from an HOA representative or any other figure, often relied on appearances. People respected rules, but they were also influenced by demeanor, composure, and subtle guidance. Understanding this principle had allowed John to turn a potentially stressful situation into a quiet victory. That evening, John decided to take a short walk around the neighborhood. The streets were calm, bathed in the golden light of sunset. Children played quietly, neighbors returned home, and the overall atmosphere had shifted to one of relaxation and ease. The HOA representatives were still visible in the distance, but their approach was less tense, more routine. John's patient strategy had subtly influenced their behavior, reinforcing the neighborhood's calm. He paused near the community park, watching the small group of residents discussing garden projects and neighborhood plans. Their conversation was light, filled with friendly laughter and casual collaboration. The presence of the HOA officers no longer created tension. Instead, the environment was cooperative, relaxed, and positive. John smiled faintly, knowing that his subtle influence had contributed to this change. Returning home, he prepared a light dinner and reflected on the week's events. The mailbox incident had been minor, yet it had set in motion a series of observations, interactions, and strategies that ultimately strengthened his position in the neighborhood. He had maintained his cover, demonstrated compliance, and subtly guided social dynamics without confrontation. After dinner, John moved to his study, reviewing notes one final time. He reflected on the power of patience, observation, and composure. Strength, he realized, often lay not in confrontation but in quiet strategy, subtle influence, and careful understanding of human behavior. As night fell, the neighborhood settled into peaceful silence. John stepped onto his porch, sipping tea and watching the streets. The houses were dark, but the calm atmosphere reflected the resolution of recent events. The HOA representatives had acknowledged his compliance, neighbors had grown to trust him, and his secret identity remained safe. Finally, John returned inside, ready for rest. He reflected on the lessons of the week. Vigilance was essential, patience was powerful, and subtle strategy could achieve results far greater than confrontation. Oakwood had returned to calm, orderly peace, and John Miller, the quiet neighbor, had once again demonstrated that true strength often lay beneath the surface. Before turning off the lights, he glanced out the window at his straight mailbox, the well-maintained garden, and the quiet street. A small smile formed on his lips. Life in Oakwood continued peacefully, unaware of the depth of his experience, the discipline of his training, and the careful strategy that had guided every interaction. As he lay down to sleep, John felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The HOA had been handled, his neighbors trusted him, and his secret remained intact. For John, the quiet victory was not about recognition, rewards, or authority. It was about maintaining control, composure, and safety while influencing his environment subtly and effectively. And so, as Oakwood Street slept under the gentle glow of streetlights, John Miller closed his eyes, secure in the knowledge that he had navigated the week with intelligence, patience, and grace. The mailbox was straight, the neighborhood was calm, and the quiet strength of one man had shaped the balance between authority, compliance, and subtle influence. In the end, the true victory was not in rules or inspections, but in the understanding that composure, observation, and quiet strategy could create lasting results. John Miller had won not through confrontation, but through careful planning, subtle guidance, and unwavering patience. Oakwood remained peaceful, orderly, and unaware of the depth of the man who lived quietly within it.